Arena would not have balked at stealing horses for the pair of them to flee. Abruptly, the date beside the name caught her eye. Two dates, actually, marked as questions. Months were seldom named, much less days numbered, except in official documents and treaties. Signed, sealed, and witnessed in the city of Ilion on the 12th day of Savan,
Excuse me.
of grace, and for reports of this nature, and entering a woman's name in the novice book. For common use, so many days before this feast day or after that sufficed. Written out, dates always looked a little strange to her. She had to count on her fingers to be sure of what she saw. Nicola ran away 3 or 4 days ago, Shiriam, and Tiana is just reporting it? She isn't even sure whether it was 3 days or 4? Nicola's cousins covered for her mother. Shiriam shook her head ruefully. Strangely, her small smile seemed amused, though, or even admiring. Not from love. Apparently they were glad to see the child go and afraid she'd be brought back. She was quite overbearing about her talent at foretelling. I'm afraid Tiana is very upset with them. None will be sitting comfortably in their classes today, or for days to come, I fear. Tiana says she intends to give them each a dose of the strap instead of breakfast every day till Nicola is found. I think she might relent, though. With Nicola gone so long before her flight was discovered, it may be some time before she's located. Egwene winced slightly. She could recall her own visits to the study of the Mistress of Novices, then occupied by the very woman in front of her. Shiriam had a strong arm. A daily dose would be fierce. But hiding a runaway's flight was more serious than sneaking out after hours or pulling a prank. She pushed the report to one side. Tiana will handle it as she sees fit, she said. Shiriam, has there been any change in how the sisters talk about my dream? She had revealed the dream about a Shanshan attack the very morning after dreaming it, and the women she told stared at her apathetically, apparently because of the freshness of Anaya's death. That had stunned everyone. Instead of answering, Shiriam cleared her throat and smoothed her blue-slashed skirts. You may not be aware, Mother, but one of Nicola's cousins is Larina Ayelen, from Emmons Field, she added, as if Egwene did not know that. No one would think you were playing favorites if you pardoned the whole family. Whether or not she relents, Tiana does mean to be very sharp with them in the meantime. They will suffer. Leaning back, carefully because of the wobbly chair leg, Egwene frowned up at the other woman. Larina was almost the same age as she, and a close friend growing up. They'd spent hours together, gossiping and practicing putting their hair in braids for when the women's circle said they were old enough. Despite that, Larina had been one of the few Emmonsfield girls who seemed to accept that Egwene might really be the Amelin seat, though she showed it mainly by keeping her distance. But did Shiriam think Egwene would play favorites? Even Swan looked taken aback. You should know better than anyone, Shiriam. Novice discipline is the province of the Mistress of Novices. Unless a girl is being abused, anyway, and you haven't suggested that. Besides, if Larina thinks she can get away with helping a runaway today, helping a runaway, Shiriam, what will she think she can get away with tomorrow? She can reach the shawl, if she has the gumption to stick with it. I won't lead her down a path that ends with her being sent away for misbehavior. Now, what are they saying about my dream? Shiriam's tilted green eyes blinked, and she glanced at Swan. Light. The woman thought Egwene was being hard because Swan was present? Because Swan might carry tales? She should know better. She had been the mistress of novices. The attitude among the sisters' mother, Shiriam said finally, is still that the Shanshan are 1,000 miles away, they don't know how to travel, and if they start marching on Tarvalin, we'll learn of it before they're within 200 leagues. Swan muttered something under her breath that sounded vile, but not surprised. Egwene wanted to curse too. Worries over Anaya's murder had had nothing to do with the sisters' apathy. They did not believe that Egwene was a dreamer. Anaya had been sure, but Anaya was dead. Swan and Liana believed, yet neither stood high enough now to be listened to with more than impatient politeness, if that. And it was quite clear that Shiriam did not believe. She obeyed her oath of fealty as scrupulously as Egwene could have wished for, but you could not order someone to believe. They only mouthed what you told them, and nothing changed. When Shiriam left, Egwene found herself wondering what had brought the woman in the first place. Could it have been just to point out that Larina was going to be punished? Surely not. But she had said nothing else, apart from answering Egwene's questions. Shortly Mirel arrived, followed closely by Morvrin. Egwene could feel each of them release the source before she entered the tent, and they left their warders waiting outside. Even in brief glimpses as the entry flaps were pushed aside, the men looked wary, even for warders. Mirel's big dark eyes flashed at the sight of Swan, and her nostrils flared. Morvrin's round face remained smooth as polished stone, but she brushed her dark brown skirts with both hands, as if wiping something off. Perhaps it was unconscious. Unlike Shiriam, they did have to accept Swan's orders, and neither liked that at all. It was not that Egwene wanted to grind their noses, but she trusted Swan, and oaths or no oaths, she did not entirely trust them. Not to the degree she did Swan. Besides, there were times it was inconvenient, if not impossible, for her to tell the sisters sworn to her what she wanted done. Swan could carry messages, and this way Egwene could be sure they were obeyed. She asked about talk of her dreams straight away, but unsurprisingly their stories were the same as Shiriam's. The Shanshan were far off. There would be plenty of warning should that change. The story had been the same for a good week and a half. Worse. It might be different if Anaya were alive, Morvern said, balancing atop one of the rickety stools in front of the writing table. In spite of her bulk, she did it easily and gracefully. Anaya had a reputation for arcane knowledge. I always thought she should have chosen Brown myself. If she said you were a dreamer. Her teeth clicked shut at a sharp look from Egwene. Mirel suddenly took an interest in warming her hands at the brazier. Neither of them believed either. Except for Swan and Liana, no one in the whole camp believed that Egwene had had a true dream. Varilyn had taken over the talks in Darine, deftly pushing Bayanin into a lesser role, and she offered constant excuses as to why she could not pass on a warning at just this moment. Perhaps in a few days, when the talks were going more smoothly. As if they were ever anything other than sisters talking in circles, without saying a word that might send the other side away offended. No one at all but Swan and Liana. She thought they believed. Mirel turned from the brazier as if steeling herself to put a hand on the coals. Mother, I've been thinking about the day Shadar Logoth was destroyed. She broke off and turned back to the brazier as a long-faced woman in deep blue entered the tent, carrying a three-legged stool painted in bright spirals. Maigan was beautiful, with large eyes and full lips, but she seemed elongated somehow. She was not that tall, but even her hands seemed long. She gave Morvern a cool nod and pointedly ignored Mirel. I brought my own seat today, Mother, she said, making as much of a curtsy as she could with the stool in one hand. Yours are rather unsteady, if I may say so. It had come as no surprise that Anaya's death meant the Blue Aja would name someone else to Egwene's advisory council, but she had hoped for the best when she learned who it was to be. Maigan had been one of Swan's allies when Swan was Amerlin. Do you mind if I send Swan for tea, Mother? Maigan said as she settled onto her stool. You really should have a novice or accepted to run errands, but Swan will do. The novices have their classes, daughter, Egwene replied, and even with the arrangement of families, the accepted hardly have time for their own studies. Besides which, she would have to send a novice or accepted to stand in the cold any time she wanted to speak to someone in privacy. Hard on one who would not yet have been taught how to ignore heat or cold, and a flag planted outside the tent telling everyone there might be something worth eavesdropping on. Swan, will you please bring us some tea? I'm sure we could all do with a hot cup. Megan raised a long-fingered hand as Swan started for the entrance. "I have a jar of mint honey in my tent," she said imperiously. "Fetch that. And mind you don't filch any. I remember you used to have a sweet tooth. Hurry now." Megan had been an ally. Now she was one of many sisters who blamed Swan for breaking the White Tower. "As you say, Megan," Swan replied in a meek voice, and even bent her knee slightly before she hurried out. And she did hurry. Megan stood as high as Mirel or Morvran, and there were no orders or oaths of fealty to protect her here. The long-faced woman gave a small, satisfied nod. Swan had to beg to be accepted back into the Blue Aja, and rumor had it that Megan had been the most insistent on the begging. Morvran made her excuses to leave behind Swan, perhaps meaning to catch her up for some reason, but Mirel took one of the stools and engaged in a competition with Megan. Who could ignore the other most completely? Egwene did not understand the animosity between the two women. Sometimes people just disliked one another. In any case, it did not make for conversation. Egwene took the opportunity to leaf through the pages in Swan's folders, but she could not concentrate on rumors out of Ilion and innuendos out of Cairhien. There seemed nothing to account for Theodrin's claim of a tale that had set the yellow sitters buzzing. Swan would have said something if she had known. Megan and Mirel stared at her as if watching her turn over sheets of paper was the most interesting activity in the world. She would have sent them both away, but she wanted to find out what Mirel had been thinking about the day Shadar Logoth had been scooped out of the earth. She could not send one away without sending both. Drat the pair of them. When Swan returned with a wooden tray holding a silver teapot and porcelain cups, and Megan's white-glazed honey jar, she was followed into the tent by a soldier in plate and mail armor, a young Shienaran with his hair shaved off except for a topknot. Young, but not young. Ragan's dark cheek carried a puckered white scar from an arrow, and his face was hard, in the way only the face of a man who lived with death every hour could be hard. As Swan distributed teacups, he bowed, one hand holding a moon-crested helmet on his hip, the other on his sword hilt. Nothing in his expression said he had ever met her before. "Honored to serve, mother," he said formally. "Lord Bryn sent me. He said to tell you that it seems the raiders may have crossed to this side of the river last night, with Aes Sedai. Lord Bryn is doubling the patrols. He advises that sisters stay close to the camp, to avoid incidents." "May I be excused, mother?" Swan said suddenly, with the slightly abashed sound of a woman who found herself with an urgent need for the jakes. "Yes, yes," Egwene said, as impatiently as she could manage, and barely waited for the other woman to dash out of the tent before going on. "Tell Lord Bryn that Aes Sedai go where they wish when they wish." She snapped her mouth shut before she could call him Ragan, but that only served to make her seem severe. She hoped it did. "I will tell him, mother," he replied, making another bow. "Heart and soul to serve." Megan smiled faintly as he departed. She deprecated soldiers. Warders were good and necessary. Soldiers made messes for others to clean up, in her opinion. But she did favor anything that seemed to indicate a wedge between Egwene and Gareth Bryn. Or perhaps better to say that Lelaine favored. In this, Megan was Lelaine's woman to her toenails. Mirel merely looked puzzled. She knew that Egwene got on well with Lord Gareth. Egwene got up and poured herself a cup of tea, and took a touch of Megan's honey. Her hands were quite steady. Boats were in place. In a few hours Lyanna would gather Boda and ride well away from the camp before explaining what they were going to do. Larina must take the punishment she had earned, and Boda must do what needed doing. Egwene had been younger than Boda when she was set to hunt Black Sisters. Shienaran served their war against the Shadow and the Plight heart and soul. Aes Sedai and those who would become Aes Sedai served the Tower, a stronger weapon against the Shadow than any sword, and no less sharp to an unwary hand. When Romanda arrived, with Theodrin to hold open the entry flap for her, the grey-haired Yellow made a very exact curtsy, neither a fraction more nor less than propriety required from sitter to Amerlin. They were not in the hall now. If the Amerlin was only first among equals there, she was a little more in her own study, even for Romanda. She did not offer to kiss Egwene's ring, though. There were limits. She eyed Mirel and Mygan as if thinking of asking them to leave, or perhaps telling them. It was a prickly point. Sitters expected obedience, but neither was of her Aja, and this was the Amerlin's study. In the end she did neither, merely allowed Theodrin to take her cloak, embroidered with borders of yellow flowers, and pour her a cup of tea. Theodrin did not have to be asked to do either, and she retreated to a corner, twitching her shawl and her mouth set sullenly as Romanda took the empty stool. Despite the stool's uneven legs, Romanda managed to make it seem a seat in the hall of the tower, or maybe a throne, as she adjusted the yellow-fringed shawl she had worn beneath her cloak. "The talks are going badly," she said in that high musical voice. She still made it sound a proclamation. "Varalin is chewing her lips in frustration. Magla is frustrated too, for that matter, and even Soroya. When Soroya starts grinding her teeth, most sisters would be shouting." Excepting Janya, every sitter who had held a chair before the tower divided had insinuated herself into the negotiations. They were talking with women they had known in the hall back then, after all. Vayanin was nearly reduced to running errands. Romanda touched the tea to her lips, then held the cup out to one side on its dish without saying a word. Theodrin darted from the corner to take the cup over to the tray, adding honey before she returned the cup to the sitter and herself to the corner. Romanda tasted the tea again and nodded in approval. Theodrin's face colored. "The talks will go as they go," Egwene said carefully. Romanda had opposed any sort of negotiations, spurious or not, and she knew what was to happen tonight. Keeping the hall in the dark about that had seemed a needless slap in the face. The tight bun on the back of Romanda's head bobbed as she nodded. "They have shown us one thing already. Elida won't allow the sitters speaking for her to budge an inch. She is dug into the tower like a rat in a wall. The only way to flush her is to send ferrets in after her." Mirel made a sound in her throat, earning a surprised glance from Mygan. Romanda's eyes remained steady on Egwene's. "Elida will be removed, one way or another," Egwene said calmly, setting her teacup down on its dish. Her hand did not shake. What had the women learned? How? Romanda grimaced faintly at her tea, as if after all it lacked sufficient honey, or in disappointment that Egwene had not said more. The woman shifted on her stool with the air of a swordswoman setting herself for another attack, blade coming up. "The things you've said about the kin, Mother. That there are over 1,000 of them rather than a few dozen. That some are 500 or 600 years old." She shook her head over the impossibility. "How could all of that have escaped the tower?" She was challenging, not asking a question. "We only recently learned how many Wilders there are among the sea folk," Egwene replied gently. "And we still aren't sure how many there really are." Romanda's grimace was not so small this time. It had been the yellow that first confirmed hundreds of sea folk Wilders in Ilion alone. First blow to Egwene. One blow was not enough to finish Romanda, though, or even to wound her very badly. "We will have to hunt them down once our business is done here," she said in grim tones. "Letting a few dozen remain in Ebudar and Tar Valon just to help us trace runaways was one thing, but we cannot allow 1,000 Wilders to remain organized." She put even more contempt into the word, into the idea of Wilders organizing, than she did into the rest. Mirel and Mygun were watching closely, listening. Mygan was even leaning forward, she was so intent. Neither knew more than the stories Egwene had spread, which everyone assumed came through Swan's eyes and ears. Well over 1,000, Egwene corrected, and not one a wilder. All women sent away from the tower, except for a few runaways who evaded capture. She did not raise her voice, but she made each point firmly, meeting Ramonda's gaze. In any case, how do you propose to hunt them down? They are spread through every country, in every sort of occupation. Ebudar was the only place they ever gathered or met other than by chance, and all those fled when the Shomshan came. Since the Trolloc Wars, the kin have allowed the tower to know only what they wanted known. 2,000 years, hiding under the White Tower's nose. Their numbers have grown while the tower's numbers dwindled. How do you propose to find them now, among all the wilders out there that the tower has always ignored because they were too old to become novices? Kinswomen don't stand out in any way, Ramonda. They use the power almost as often as Aes Sedai, but they show age like anyone else, if more slowly. If they want to remain hidden, we will never be able to find them. And that was several more blows for Egwene, with none taken. Ramonda wore a faint sheen of sweat on her forehead, a sure sign of desperation in an Aes Sedai.
Right back, everyone.
Mirel was sitting very still, but Mygan seemed about to fall off her stool onto her nose, no matter how steady it was. Ramonda licked her lips. If they channel, they would achieve the look. If they age, they cannot be channeling very often, if at all. And neither way could they live 500 or 600 years. No more dissimulation, it seemed. There is only one real difference between Aes Sedai and the kin, Egwene said quietly. The words still seemed loud. Even Ramonda appeared to be holding her breath. They left the White Tower before they could swear on the oath rod. There. It was in the open, finally. Ramonda jerked as if she had taken a mortal blow. "You've not taken the oaths yet," she said hoarsely. "Do you mean to abandon them? To ask sisters to abandon them?" Or Mygan gasped. Perhaps both. "No," Egwene said sharply. "The 3 oaths are what make us Aes Sedai, and I will swear on the oath rod as soon as it is ours." Drawing a deep breath, she modulated her tone. But she leaned toward the other woman, too, trying to draw her in, to include her, to convince her. She almost stretched out a hand. "As it is, sisters retire to spend their last years in quiet, Ramonda. Wouldn't it be better if those were not their last years? If sisters retired into the kin, they could tie the kin to the tower. There would be no need for a futile hunt then. She had gone this far, she might as well go the last step. The oath rod can unbind as well as bind." Mygan thudded to the carpets on her knees and scrambled up, brushing at her skirts as indignantly as if she had been pushed. Mirel's olive face looked a little pale. Moving slowly, Ramonda set her teacup on the edge of the writing table and stood, drawing her shawl around her. Expressionless, she stood staring down at Egwene, while Theodrin settled her yellow-embroidered cloak on her shoulders, fastened the golden pin, and arranged the folds as carefully as any lady's maid. Only then did Ramonda speak, in a voice like stone. "When I was a little girl, I dreamed of becoming Aes Sedai. From the day I reached the White Tower, I tried to live as an Aes Sedai. I have lived as Aes Sedai, and I will die as Aes Sedai. This cannot be allowed." She turned smoothly to go, but she knocked over the stool she had been sitting on, apparently without noticing. Theodrin hurried out after her, with concern on her face, oddly enough. "Mother," Mirel drew a deep breath, fingers plucking at her deep green skirts. "Mother, are you really suggesting—" She trailed off, apparently unable to say it. Mygan sat on her stool as though forcing herself not to lean forward again. "I have laid out the facts," Egwene said calmly. Any decision will be the Hall's. Tell me, daughter, would you choose to die when you could live and continue to serve the tower? The green sister and the blue exchanged glances, then realized what they had done and snapped back to ignoring one another. Neither answered, but Egwene could almost see the thoughts churning behind their eyes. After a few moments, she got up and set the stool back upright. Even that failed to rouse them further than perfunctory apologies for making her see to that herself. Then they lapsed into silent reflection. She tried to return to the pages in Swan's folders. The stalemate at the Stone of Tyr was dragging on, and no one admitted to any idea of how it would end. But not long after Ramonda's departure, Lelaine arrived. Unlike Ramonda, the slender blue sitter was alone and poured her own tea. Settling onto the empty stool, she tossed her fur-lined cloak back over both shoulders and let it hang from a silver cloak pin set with large sapphires. She wore her shawl, too. Sitters usually did. Lelaine was more direct than Ramonda, or so it might have seemed on the surface. Her eyes held a sharp glitter. Baron's death put another crimp in the chances of making any sort of agreement with the Black Tower, she murmured over her teacup, inhaling the fumes. And then there's poor Hugh to deal with. Perhaps Mirelle will take him. Two of her three belonged to someone else first. No one else has ever saved two warders whose Aes Sedai died. Egwene was not the only one to hear special emphasis in that. Mirelle's face definitely paled. She had two secrets to hide, and one was that she had four warders. The passing of Lan Mandragoran's bond from Moiraine to her had been something not done in hundreds of years. Today it was looked upon like bonding a man against his will, something not done in even more hundreds of years. 3 is enough for me, she said breathlessly. If you will excuse me, Mother? Mygon laughed softly as Mirelle left the tent, walking fast. Not so fast that she failed to embrace Saidar before the entry flaps fell, though. Of course, Lelaine said, exchanging amused looks with the other blue. They say she marries her warders, all of them. Perhaps poor Hugh won't do for a husband. He is as wide as a horse, Mygon put in. Despite her amusement over Mirelle's flight, there was no maliciousness in her voice. She was simply stating a fact. Theo was a very large man. I think I know a young blue who might take him. She isn't interested in men that way. Lelaine nodded in a way that said the young blue had found her warder. Greens can be very odd. Take Elaine Tracant, for example. Actually, I never thought Elaine would choose green. I had her marked out for the blue. The girl has a deft feel for the currents in politics, though she also has a tendency to wander into deeper water than might be safe. Wouldn't you say so, Mother? Smiling, she sipped at her tea. This was not at all like Ramonda's subtle feeling out. This was slash and slash, with the blade appearing out of nowhere. Did Lelaine know about Mirelle and Lan? Had she sent someone to Camelin, and if so, how much had she learned? Egwene wondered whether Ramonda had also felt off balance and dazed. Do you think Chiron's murder is enough to stop an agreement? She said. For all anyone knows, this could be Loghain returning for some mad revenge. Why in the light had she said that? She needed to put a rein on her tongue and keep her wits. Or more likely some poor fool from a farm around here, or one of the bridge towns. Lelaine's smile deepened, and it was mocking, not amused. Light. The woman had not shown this much disrespect in months. If Loghain wanted revenge, Mother, I suspect he would be in the White Tower trying to kill Reds. Despite her smile, her voice was smooth and level. A disturbing contrast. Perhaps that was her intention. Perhaps it's a pity he isn't doing that. He might remove Elida, but that would be easier than she deserves. No, Chiron won't stop an agreement any more than Anaya did, but the two combined will make sisters worry even harder about safeguards and strictures. We may need these men, But we must be certain we are in control. Complete control. Egwene nodded. A small nod. She agreed, but there might be difficulties bringing them to accept that, she said. Difficulties. She was displaying a positive talent for understatement today. The water bond could be modified slightly, Mygon said. As it is, you can make the man do as you wish with a little tweaking, but the need to tweak could be removed quite easily. That sounds too much like compulsion, Egwene said firmly. She had learned that weave from Moghedien, but only to work on how to counter it. The thing was filth, the theft of another person's will, of their whole being. Someone who was compelled did anything you ordered, anything, and believed it was their own choice. Just thinking about it made her feel dirty. Mygon met her gaze almost as levelly as Lelaine had, though, and her voice was as smooth as her face. She had no thoughts of filth. Compulsion was used on sisters in Cairhien. That seems certain now. But I was talking about the bond, a different thing entirely. You think you can talk the Ashaman into accepting the bond? Egwene could not keep the incredulity out of her voice. Aside from that, who is going to do this bonding? Even if every sister who doesn't have a warder took an Ashaman, and every green took 2 or 3, there aren't enough sisters. That's if you can find one who doesn't mind being bonded to a man who is going to go mad. Mygon nodded at each point as if accepting it, and adjusted her skirts as if not really listening. If the bond can be changed in one way, she said, once Egwene finished, it should be possible to change it in others. There might be a way to remove the sharing, perhaps some of the awareness. Then perhaps the madness would not be a problem. It would be a different sort of bond, not like the warder bond at all. I'm certain everyone will agree it wouldn't be like having a warder, really. Any sister could bond whatever number of Ashaman was necessary. Abruptly, Egwene realized what was happening. Lelaine sat apparently peering into her teacup, but she was studying Egwene through her eyelashes, and using Mygon as a stalking horse. Smothering anger, Egwene did not have to make her voice cold. It was ice. That sounds exactly like compulsion, Lelaine. It is compulsion, and no twisting of words will make it anything else. I will point that out to anyone else who suggests this, and I will order the birch for anyone who does more than suggest. Compulsion is banned, and it will remain banned. As you say, Lelaine replied, which might have meant anything at all. What came next was more pointed. The White Tower makes mistakes upon occasion. It is impossible to live or move without making mistakes, but we live and we go on. And if we sometimes need to conceal our mistakes whenever possible, we rectify them, even when it is painful. Putting her cup back on the tray, she left with Mygon at her heels. Mygon embraced the source before she left the tent. Lelaine did not. For a time, Egwene concentrated on keeping her breathing steady. She performed the river contained by the bank. Lelaine had not quite said that Egwene Alvir as Amerlin was a mistake that might have to be rectified, but she had come very close. At midday, Chesa brought Egwene's meal on another wooden tray, warm, crusty bread with only 1 or 2 suspiciously dark flecks, and lentil stew, with slivers of tough turnip and woody carrot, and bits of something that might have been goat. 1 spoonful was all Egwene could get down. It was not Lelaine that troubled her. Lelaine had threatened her before, if not
Hey, Crazy, how you
made
doing?
it clear that she was the Amerlin and not a
Happy New
puppet.
Year to you too, bro.
Instead of eating, she stared at Tiana's
I hope
report
you've been
lying to the
doing
side
good.
of the table. Nicola might not have gained the shawl in spite of her potential, but the tower had long experience in taking mule-headed
Just sitting here
faulconers and
smoking a
women
bowl.
and turning them into confident Aes Sedai. Larina had a bright future ahead of her, but she had to learn to obey the rules before she could begin learning which could be broken and when. The White Tower was good at teaching both things, but the first always came first. Hoda's future would be brilliant. Her potential almost equaled Egwene's. But Aes Sedai accepted office. The tower required you to do what was needed for the tower. Aes Sedai accepted Mars for Amyrlin. Teysa was voluble when she returned home almost untouched, after she had found a practically untouched
Oh,
grave.
that's so crazy.
Egwene
At
considered
least she's starting to
claiming
feel
an upset
better.
stomach and rejected it. After Chase's tea worked
I'm
on
doing
her
okay.
headaches,
Can't
at
complain
least for a
none.
few days, until they returned fiercer than ever and every night. The plump woman had turned out to have a collection of herbal remedies for every ill, purchased from every peddler with a glib tongue, and each viler tasting than the last. She had a way of looking so downhearted when you would not drink the awful mixtures that you found yourself swallowing them just to keep her from worrying. Sometimes, surprisingly, they worked, but they were never anything Egwene wanted to put in her mouth. She sent Chesa away with the tray and a promise to no doubt Chesa would present a supper big enough to stuff a goose. She felt like smiling at the thought. Chesa would stand over her, wringing her hands till she ate every bite. But her eyes fell back on Tiana's report. Nicola, Larina, and Boda. The White Tower was a strict task, mistress. Unless the tower is at war by consensus of the Hall, the Amyrlin shall not. But the tower was at war. She did not know how long she sat staring at that piece of paper with one name on it, but when Swan returned she had made up her mind. A strict task-mistress who never played favorites. "Have Lyanna and Boda gone?" she asked. "At least 2 hours ago, Mother. Lyanna had to deliver Boda and then ride down river." Egwene nodded. "Think the horses are saddled?" "No. Some people recognized the Amyrlin's horse by this time. Too many. There was no time for arguments and explanations. No time to assert her authority and make it stick. Saddle Bella, and meet me on the corner 2 streets north." Almost everyone knew Bella, too. Swan's horse, everybody knew. "What do you mean to do, Mother?" Swan asked worriedly. "I mean to take a ride. And, Swan, tell no one." She caught the other woman's eyes, held them with her own. Swan had been Amyrlin and able to stare down a stone. Egwene was Amyrlin now. "Not anyone, Swan. Now go on, go, and hurry." Forehead still creased, Swan hurried. As soon as she was alone, Egwene slid the stole from her neck, folded it carefully, and tucked it into her belt pouch. Her cloak was good wool and stout, but quite plain. Without the stole dangling from her cowl, she could have been anyone. The walkway in front of her study was empty, of course, but
Oh,
once she
yeah.
crossed the frozen street, she made her way through the usual white river of novices, speckled with accepted and the occasional Aes Sedai. The novices bent knees to her without slowing, the accepted offered curtsies as she passed, once they saw that the skirts beneath her cloak were not banded white, and the Aes Sedai glided along with their own faces hidden by their cowls. If any noticed that she was not followed by a warder, well, a number of sisters lacked warders, and not everyone was surrounded by the glowing nimbus of Saidar, just most. 2 streets from her study she stopped at the edge of the wooden walkway, facing away from the stream of hurrying women. She tried not to fret. The sun set halfway down toward the horizon in the west, a golden ball stabbed by the broken peak of Dragon Mount. The mountain's shadow already stretched across the camp, casting the tents in evening dimness. At last Swan appeared, mounted on Bella. The shaggy little mare walked sure-footed on the slick street, but Swan clung to reins and saddle as if she were afraid of falling off. Maybe she was. Swan was one of the worst riders Egwene had ever seen. When she scrambled down from the saddle in a flurry of skirts and muttered curses, she looked relieved to have escaped with her life. Bella whickered at Egwene in recognition. Tugging her disarrayed cowl back into place, Swan opened her mouth too, but Egwene held up a warning hand before the other woman could speak. She could see the word "mother" forming on Swan's lips. and likely it would have been loud enough to be heard 50 paces off. Tell no one,
How's the
Egwene said
weather for you,
softly,
crazy?
and no notes or hints either. That should cover everything. Keep Chaser company till I get back. I don't want her worried. Swan gave a reluctant nod. Her mouth almost looked sullen. Egwene suspected she had been wise to add notes and hints. Leaving the woman on the Amerlin seat looking like a sulky girl, she climbed smoothly into Bella's saddle. She had to walk the stout mare at first because of the frozen ruts in the camp's streets, and because everyone would wonder if they saw Swan riding Bella at anything faster than a walk. She tried to ride like Swan, swaying uncertainly, clinging to the saddle's tall pommel with one hand and sometimes both. It made her feel as if she were about to fall off too. Bella twisted her head around to look at her. She knew who was on her back, and she knew Egwene rode better than this. Egwene continued to imitate Swan and tried not to think about where the sun stood, all the way out of the camp beyond the rows of wagons until the first trees hid her from tents and wagons. Then she bent over the pommel to press her face into Bella's mane. "You carried me away from the troopers," she whispered. "Can you run as fast now?" Straightening, she dug in her heels. Bella could not gallop like Daishar, but her sturdy legs churned through the snow. She had been a cart horse once, not a racer or war horse, but she gave what she had, stretching out her neck as bravely as Daishar ever could. Bella raced, and the sun slid slower as if the sky had suddenly become greased. Egwene lay low in the saddle and urged the mare on. A race with the sun that Egwene knew she could not win. But even if she could not beat the sun, there was still time. She thumped her heels in time with Bella's hooves, and Bella ran. Twilight rolled over them, and then darkness before Egwene saw the moon glinting on the water of the Aranon. Still time. It was almost the spot where she had sat Daishar with Gareth, watching the river ship slide toward Tarvalon. Reining Bella in, she listened. Stillness, and then a muffled curse. The quiet grunts and scrapes of men dragging a heavy burden across the snow and trying for silence. She turned Bella through the trees toward the sounds. Shadows stirred, and she heard the soft whisper of steel sliding from scabbards. Then a man muttered, not far enough under his breath, "I know that pony. It's one of the sisters. The one they say used to be Amerlin. She doesn't look it to me. No older'n the one they say's Amerlin now." "Bella is not a pony," Egwene said crisply. "Take me to Boda Kotham." A dozen men coalesced out of the night shadows among the trees, surrounding her and Bella. They all seemed to think she was Swan, but that was all right. To them, Aes Sedai was Aes Sedai, and they guided her to where Boda was sitting a horse, not much taller than Bella, and holding a dark cloak around her. Her dress was dark, too. White would have stood out tonight. Boda recognized Bella, too, and reached out to scratch the mare's ear fondly when Egwene rode up beside her. "You're staying ashore," Egwene said quietly. "You can go back with me when it's done." Boda jerked her hand back as if stung at the sound of Egwene's voice. "Why?" she said, not quite a demand. She had learned that much, at least. "I can do this. Liana said I explained it to me, and I can do it." "I know you can, but not as well as I can. Not yet." That seemed too much like a criticism that the other woman had not earned. "I am the Amerlin seat, Boda. Some decisions only I can make, and some things I shouldn't ask a novice to do when I can do them better." Perhaps that was not a great deal milder, but she could not explain about Larina and Nicola, or the price the White Tower demanded of all its daughters. The Amerlin could not explain the one to a novice, and a novice was not ready to learn about the other. Even in the night, the set of Boda's shoulders said she did not understand, but she had learned not to argue with Aes Sedai, too, just as she had learned that Egwene was Aes Sedai. The rest she would learn eventually. The tower could take all the time it needed to teach her. Dismounting, Egwene handed Bella's reins to one of the soldiers and raised her skirts to tramp through the snow toward the labored sounds of dragging. It was a large rowboat, being pushed and pulled across the snow like a sled. A bulky sled that had to be maneuvered between trees, though with fewer curses once the men doing the pushing and pulling realized that she was following them closely. Most men guarded their tongues around Aes Sedai, and if they could not see her face between the darkness and her cowl, who else would be down here by the river? If they knew she was not the same woman intended at first to accompany them, who questioned Aes Sedai? They eased the boat into the river, careful of splashes, and 6 men scrambled aboard to set oars in rag-padded oarlocks. The men went barefoot to avoid the noise of a boot scraping on the hull planks. Smaller boats plied these waters, but tonight they had to master the currents. One of the men on the bank gave her a hand to steady herself climbing in, and she settled on a seat in the bow, holding her cloak close. The boat slid away from the bank, silent except for the faint swirl of the oars in the water. Egwene looked ahead, south toward Tarvalon. The white walls gleamed in the light of a fat, waning moon, and lamplit windows gave the city a muted glow, almost as if the island was embracing Saidar. The white tower stood out even in the darkness, windows alight, the great mass shining. Something soon, and her breath caught. For an instant she thought it had been a Drakkar, an evil son of all nights. Only a bat, she decided. Spring might be near enough for bats to be venturing out. Pulling her cloak tighter, she peered toward the city, drawing nearer. Nearer. As the tall wall of North Harbor loomed in front of the boat, the oarsmen backed water so the bow just missed kissing the wall beside the harbor entrance. Egwene almost put out a hand to fend off from the pale stone before the boat could bump into the wall. That thump would surely have been heard by the soldiers on guard. The oars made only a small gurgling noise as they swept back, though, and the boat stopped where she could have touched the massive iron chain across the harbor, its huge links giving off their own faint gleam from the grease coating them. There was no need for touching, though, no need for waiting either. Embracing silence, clearly aware of the thrill of life filling her before she had the weaves in place. Earth, fire, and air surrounding the chain, earth and fire touching it. The black iron flashed to white across the whole width of the harbor mouth. She had just time to realize that someone had embraced the source not far away, above her on the wall. Then something struck the boat, struck her, and she was aware of cold water enveloping her, filling her nose, her mouth. Darkness. Egwene felt hardness beneath her. She heard women's voices, excited voices. "Do you know who this is?" "Well, well, we certainly got better than we bargained for tonight." Something was pressed to her mouth, and warmth trickled in, tasting faintly of mint. She swallowed convulsively, suddenly aware of how cold she was, shivering. Her eyes flickered open, and fastened on the face of the woman holding her head and the cup. Lanterns held by soldiers crowding around gave light enough for her to make out the face clearly. An ageless face. She was inside North Harbor. "That's it, girl," the Aes Sedai said encouragingly. "Drink it all down. A strong dose for now." Egwene tried to push the cup away, tried to embrace Saidar, but she could feel herself sliding back down into darkness. They had been waiting for her. She had been betrayed. But by whom?
Epilogue. An answer. Rand stared out of the window at the steady rain falling out of a gray sky. Another storm done out of the spine of the world. The Dragon Wall. He thought spring must be coming. Spring always came, eventually. Earlier here in Tyr than back home, it should be, though there seemed little sign of it. Lightning forked silver blue across the sky, and long moments passed before the peal of thunder. Distant lightning. The wounds in his side ached, like the herons branded into his palms ached after all this time. Sometimes pain is all that lets you know you're alive, Luce Theron whispered. Rand ignored the voice in his head. The door creaked open behind him, and he looked over his shoulder at the man who came into the sitting room. Bashir was wearing a short gray silk coat, a rich, shimmering coat, and he had the baton of the Marshal General of Saldaia, an ivory rod tipped with a golden wolf's head, tucked behind his belt next to his scabbarded sword. His turned-down boots had been waxed till they shone. Rand tried not to let his relief show. They had been gone long enough. "Well," he said. "The Shonchan are amenable," Bashir replied. "Crazy as loons, but amenable. They require a meeting with you in person, though. The Marshal General of Saldaia isn't the Dragon Reborn." "With this Lady Seroth?" Bashir shook his head. "Apparently a member of their royal family has arrived. Seroth wants you to meet someone called the Daughter of the Nine Moons." Thunder rolled again for distant lightning. We rode on the winds of the rising storm. We ran to the sounds of the thunder. We danced among the lightning bolts, and tore the world asunder. Anonymous fragment of a poem believed written near the end of the previous age, known by some as the Third Age, sometimes attributed to the Dragon Reborn.
Prayed to the pile of garments that were to go to the wash.
Epilogue. An answer.
Here's a recommended preview based on your
With our sweetness of victory and the bitterness of defeat are like a knife of dreams. From
Can an instantaneous cube exist? Chapter 1 of The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Nelson. The Time
Give me
Machine.
1 second, everyone. I'll be right back.
The time traveler, or so it will be convenient to speak of him, was expounding a recondite matter to us. His gray eyes shone and twinkled, and his usually pale face was flushed and animated. The fire burned brightly, and the soft radiance of the incandescent lights in the lilies of silver caught the bubbles that flashed and passed in our glasses. Our chairs, being his patents, embraced and caressed us rather than submitted to be sat upon, and there was that luxurious after-dinner atmosphere when thought roams gracefully free of the trammels of precision. And he put it to us in this way, marking the points with a lean forefinger, as we sat and lazily admired his earnestness over his new paradox, as we thought it, and his fecundity. You must follow me carefully. I shall have to controvert one or two ideas that are almost universally accepted. The geometry, for instance, they taught you at school is founded on a misconception. Is not that a rather large thing to expect us to begin upon? Said Philby, an argumentative person with red hair. I do not mean to ask you to accept anything without reasonable ground for it. You will soon admit as much as I need from you. You know, of course, that a mathematical line, a line of thickness, nil, has no real existence. They taught you that? Neither has a mathematical plane. These things are mere abstractions. That is all right, said the psychologist. Or, having only length, breadth, and thickness, can a cube have a real existence? There I object, said Phil. Of course a solid body may exist. All real things, so most people think. But wait a moment. Can an instantaneous cube exist? Don't follow you, said Philby. Can a cube that does not last for any time at all have a real existence? Philby became pensive. Clearly, the time traveler proceeded, any real body must have extension in 4 directions. It must have length, breadth, thickness, and duration. But through a natural infirmity of the flesh, which I will explain to you in a moment, we incline to overlook this fact. There are really 4 dimensions, 3 which we call the 3 planes of space, and a 4th, time. There is, however, a tendency to draw an unreal distinction between the former 3 dimensions and the latter, because it happens that our consciousness moves intermittently in one direction, along the latter, from the beginning to the end of our lives. That, said a very young man, making spasmodic efforts to relight his cigar over the lamp, that very clear indeed. Now, it is very remarkable that this is so extensively overlooked, continued the time traveler with a slight accession of cheerfulness. Really, this is what is meant by the 4th dimension, though some people who talk about the 4th dimension do not know they mean it. It is only another way of looking at time. There is no difference between time and any of the 3 dimensions of space, except that our consciousness moves along it. But some foolish people have got hold of the wrong side of that idea. You have all heard what they have to say about this 4th dimension? I have not, said the provincial mayor. It is simply this. Space, as our master is spoken of as having 3 dimensions, which one may call length, breadth, and thickness, and is always definable by reference to 3 planes, each at right angles to the others. But some philosophical people have been asking, why 3 dimensions particularly? Why not another direction at right angles to the other 3? And have even tried to construct a 4-dimension geometry. Professor Simon Newcomb was expounding this to the New York Mathematical Society only a month or so ago. You know how on a flat surface, which has only two dimensions, we can represent a figure of a three-dimensional solid. And similarly, they think that by models of three dimensions, they could represent one of four, if they could master the perspective of the thing. See? I think so, murmured the provincial mayor, and knitting his brows, he lapsed into an introspective state, his lips moving as one who repeats mystic words. Yes, I think I see it now, he said after some time, brightening in a quite transitory manner. Well, I do not mind telling you, I have been at work upon this geometry of four dimensions for some time. Some of my results are curious. For instance, here is a portrait of a man at 8 years old, another at 15, another at 17, another at 23, and so on. All these are evidently sections, as it were, three-dimensional representations of his four-dimensioned being, which is a fixed and unalterable thing. Scientific people, proceeded the time traveler, after the pause required for the proper assimilation of this, know very well that time is only a kind of space. Here is a popular scientific diagram, a weather record. This line I trace with my finger shows the movement of the barometer. Yesterday it was so high, yesterday night it fell, then this morning it rose again, and so gently upward to here. Surely the mercury did not trace this line in any of the dimensions of space generally recognized, but certainly it traced such a line, and that line, therefore, we must conclude was along the time dimension. But, said the medical man, staring hard at a coal in the fire, if time is really only a fourth-dimensional space, why is it, and why has it always been, regarded as something different? And why cannot we move in time as we move about in the other dimensions of space? The time traveler smiled. Are you sure we can move freely in space? Right and left we can go, backward and forward freely enough, and men always have done so. I admit we move freely in two dimensions. But how about up and down? Gravitation limits us there. Not exactly, said the medical man. There are balloons. But before the balloons, save for spasmodic jumping and the inequalities of the surface, man had no freedom of vertical movement. Still, they could move a little up and down, said the medical man. Easier, far easier down than up. And you cannot move at all in time. You cannot get away from the present moment. My dear sir, that is just where you are wrong. That is just where the whole world has gone wrong. We are always getting away from the present moment. Our mental existences, which are immaterial and have no dimensions, are passing along the time dimension with a uniform velocity from the cradle to the grave, just as we should travel down if we began our existence 50 miles above the Earth's surface. But the great difficulty is this, interrupted the psychologist. You can move about in all directions of space, but you cannot move about in time. That is the germ of my great discovery. But you are wrong to say that we cannot move about in time. For instance, if I am recalling an incident very vividly, I go back to the instant of its occurrence. I become absent-minded, as you say. I jump back for a moment. Of course, we have no means of staying back for any length of time, any more than a savage or an animal has of staying 6 feet above the ground. But a civilized man is better off than the savage in this respect. He can go up against gravitation in a balloon. And why should he not hope that, ultimately, he may be able to stop or accelerate his drift along the time dimension, or even turn about and travel the other way? Oh, this, began Philby, is all why not, said the time traveler. It's against reason, said Philby. What reason? Said the time traveler. You can show black is white by argument, said Philby, but you will never convince me. Possibly not, said the time traveler. But now you begin to see the object of my investigations into the geometry of four dimensions. Long ago, I had a vague inkling of a machine. To travel through time, exclaimed the very young man, that shall travel indifferently in any direction of space and time, as the driver determines. Philby contented himself with laughter. But I have experimental verification, said the time traveler. It would be remarkably convenient for the historian, the psychologist suggested. One might travel back and verify the accepted account of the Battle of Hastings, for instance. Don't you think you would attract attention? Said the medical man. Our ancestors had no great tolerance for anachronisms. One might get one's Greek from the very lips of Homer and Plato, the very young man thought. In which case, they would certainly plow you for the little go. The German scholars have improved Greek so much. Then there's the future, said the very young man. Just think, one might invest all one's money, leave it to accumulated interest, and hurry on ahead. To discover a society, said I, erected on a strictly communistic basis. Of all the wild, extravagant theories, began the psychologist. Yes, so it seemed to me, and so I never talked of it until. Experimental verification, cried I. You were going to verify that? The experiment, cried Philby, who was getting brain weary. Let us see your experiment anyhow, said the psychologist. Though it's all humbug, you know. The time traveler smiled round at us. Then, still smiling faintly, and with his hands deep in his trousers pockets, he walked slowly out of the room. We heard his slippers shuffling down the long passage to his laboratory. The psychologist looked at us. I wonder what he's got. Some sleight of hand trick or other, said the medical man, and Philby tried to tell us about a conjurer he had seen at Burslem. But before he had finished his preface, the time traveler came back, and Philby's anecdote collapsed. The thing the time traveler held in his hand was a
Hey, Soy, how you doing?
scarcely larger than a small clock, and very delicately made. There was ivory in it, and some transparent crystalline substance. And now I must be explicit, for this that follows,
Just smoking a
unless his
bowl.
explanation is to be accepted, is an absolutely unaccountable thing. He took one of the small octagonal tables that were scattered about the room, and set it in front of the fire, with two legs on the hearthrug. On this table he placed the mechanism. Then he drew up a chair and sat down. The only other object on the table was a small shaded lamp, the bright light of which fell upon the model. There were also perhaps a dozen candles about, two in brass candlesticks upon the mantel, and several in sconces, so that the room was brilliantly illuminated. I sat in a low armchair and drew this forward so as to be almost between the time traveler and the fireplace. Philby sat behind him,
Right,
looking
safety
over his
meeting.
shoulder. The medical man and the provincial mayor watched him in profile from the right, the psychologist from the left. The very young man stood behind the psychologist. We were all on the alert. It appears incredible to me
Nice
that any kind
bowl,
of trick,
topped with some
however
wax.
subtly conceived and however adroitly done, would have been played upon us under these conditions. The time traveler looked at us and then at the mechanism. Well, said the psychologist, this little affair, said the time traveler, resting his elbows upon the table and pressing his hands together above the apparatus, is only a model. It is my plan for a machine to travel through time. You will notice that it looks singularly askew, and that there is an odd twinkling of
Always
lights
gotta
out of the
have a
spine,
safety
as
meeting.
though it was in some way unreal. He pointed to the part with his finger. Also, here is one little white lever, and here is another. The medical man got up out of his chair and peered into the thing. It's beautifully made, he said. It took 2 years to make, retorted the time traveler. Then, when we had all imitated the action of the medical man, he said, Now, I want you clearly to understand that this lever sends the machine gliding into the future, and the time reverses the motion. The saddle represents the seat of the time. Presently, I am going to press the lever, and off the machine will go, vanish, pass into future time, and disappear. Have a good look at the thing. Look at the table, too, and satisfy yourselves there is no trickery. I don't want to waste this model and then be told I'm a quack. There was a minute's pause, perhaps. The psychologist seemed about to speak to me, but changed his mind. Then the time traveler put forth his finger towards the lever. No, he said suddenly. Let me look. And turning to that individual's hand in his own, he put out his forefinger, so that it was the psychologist himself who sent forth the model time machine on its interminable voyage. We all saw the lever turn. I am absolutely certain there was no trickery. There was a breath of wind, and the lamp flame jumped. One of the candles on the mantel was blown out, and the little machine suddenly swung round, became indistinct, was seen as a ghost for a second perhaps, as an eddy of faintly glittering brass and ivory, and it was gone, vanished. Save for the lamp, the table was bare. Everyone was silent for a minute. Then Philby said it was damned. The psychologist recovered from his stupor and suddenly looked under the table. At that, the time traveler laughed cheerfully. Well, he said, with a reminiscence of the psychologist. Then, getting up, he went to the tobacco jar on the mantel, and with his back to us, began to fill his pipe. We stared at each other. Look here, said the medical man. Are you in earnest about this? Do you seriously believe that that machine has traveled into time? Certainly, said the time traveler, stooping to light a spill at the fire. Then he turned, lighting his pipe, to look at the psychologist's face. The psychologist, to show that he was not unhinged, helped himself to a cigar and tried to light it uncut. What is more, I have a big machine nearly finished in there, indicated the laboratory, and when that is put together, I mean to have a journey on my own account. You mean to say that that machine has traveled into the future? Said Philby. Into the future or the past. I don't for certain know which. After an interval, the psychologist had an inspiration. It must have gone into the past, if it has gone anywhere, he said. Why? Said the time traveler. Because I presume that it has not moved in space, and if it traveled into the future, it would still be here all this time, since it must have traveled through this time. But, I said, if it traveled into the past, it would have been visible when we came first into this room, and last Thursday when we were here, and the Thursday before that, and so forth. Serious objections, remarked the provincial mayor, with an air of impartiality, turning towards the time traveler. Not a bit, said the time traveler, and to the psychologist, you think you can explain that. It's presentation below the threshold, you know, diluted presentation. Of course, said the psychologist, reassured us. That's a simple point of psychology. I should have thought of it. It's plain enough and helps the paradox delightfully. We cannot see it, nor can we appreciate this machine any more than we can the spoke of a wheel spinning, or a bullet flying through the air. If it is traveling through time or 100 times faster than we are, if it gets to a minute while the impression it makes will of course be only 1/50th or 100th of what it would make if it were not traveling in time. That's plain enough. He passed his hand through the space in which the machine had been. You see, he said, laughing. We sat and stared at the vacant table for a minute or so. Then the time traveler asked us what we thought of it all. It sounds plausible enough tonight, said the medical man, but wait until tomorrow. Wait for the common sense of the morning. Would you like to see the time machine itself? Asked the time traveler. And therewith Taking the lamp in his hand, he led the way down the long, drafty corridor to his laboratory. I remember vividly the flickering light, his queer, broad head in silhouette, the dance of the shadows, how we all followed him, puzzled but incredulous, and how, there in the laboratory, we beheld a larger edition of the little mechanism which we had seen vanish from before our eyes. Parts were of nickel, parts of iron, parts had certainly been filed or sawn out of rock crystal. The thing was generally complete, but the twisted crystalline bars lay unfinished upon the bench beside some sheets of drawings, and I took one up for a better look at it. Quartz it seemed to be. "Look here," said the medical man. "Are you perfectly serious? Or is this a trick, like that ghost you showed us last Christmas?" "Upon that machine," said the time traveler, holding the lamp aloft, "I intend to explore time. Is that plain? I was never more serious in my life." None of us quite knew how to take it. I caught Philby's eye over the shoulder of the medical man, and he winked at me solemnly. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Time Machine, Chapter 2. I think that at the time, none of us quite believed in the time machine. The fact is, the time traveler was one of those men who are too clever to be believed. You never felt that you saw all round him. You always suspected some subtle reserve, some ingenuity in ambush behind his lucid frankness. Had Philby shown the model and explained the matter in the time traveler's words, we should have shown him far less skepticism, or we should have perceived his motives. Pork Butcher could understand Philby, but the time traveler had more than a touch of whim among his elements, and we distrusted him. Things that would have made the frame of a less clever man seemed tricks in his hands. It is a man who takes things too easily. The serious people who took him seriously never felt quite sure of his deportment. They were somehow aware that trusting their reputations for judgment with him was like furnishing a nursery with eggshell china. So I didn't think any of us said very much about time traveling in the interval between that Thursday and the next, though its odd potentialities ran, no doubt, in most of our minds. Its plausibility, that is, its practical incredibleness, the curious possibilities of anachronism, and of utter confusion it suggested. For my own part, I was particularly preoccupied with the trick of the model. That I remember discussing with the medical man, whom I met on Friday at the Linnaean. He said he had seen a similar thing at Tübingen, and laid considerable stress on the blowing out of the candle. But how the trick was done, he could not explain. The next Thursday, I went again to Richmond. I suppose I was one of the time traveler's most constant guests, and arriving late, found 4 or 5 men already assembled in his drawing room. The medical man was standing before the fire with a sheet of paper in one hand and his watch in the other. I looked around for the time traveler, and "It's 7:30 now," said the medical man. "I suppose we'd better have dinner." "Where's," said I, naming our host. "You've just come? It's rather odd. He's unavoidably detained. He asks me in this note to lead off with dinner at 7 if he's not back. Says he'll explain when he comes." "It seems a pity to let the dinner spoil," said the editor of a well-known daily paper, and thereupon the doctor rang the bell. The psychologist was the only person besides the doctor and myself who had attended the previous dinner. The other men were Blank, the editor aforementioned, a certain journalist, and another, a quiet, shy man, whom I didn't know, and who, as far as my observation went, never opened his mouth all the evening. There was some speculation at the dinner table about the time traveler's absence, and I suggested time traveling in a half jocular spirit. The editor wanted that explained to him, and the psychologist volunteered a wooden account of the ingenious paradox and trick we had witnessed that day week. He was in the midst of his exposition when the door from the corridor opened slowly and without noise. I was facing the door and saw it first. "Hello," I said. "At last." And the door opened wider, and the time traveler stood before us. I gave a cry of surprise. "Good heavens, man, what's the matter?" cried the medical man, who saw him next, and the whole tableful turned towards the door. He was in an amazing plight. His coat was dusty and dirty, and smeared with green down the sleeves, his hair disordered, and, as it seemed to me, grayer, either with dust and dirt, or because its color had actually faded. His face was ghastly pale. His chin had a brown cut on it, a cut half healed. His expression was haggard and drawn, as by intense suffering. For a moment he hesitated in the doorway, as if he had been dazzled by the light. Then he came into the room. He walked with just such a limp as I have seen in foot-sore tramps. We stared at him in silence, expecting him to speak. He said not a word, but came painfully to the table and made a motion towards the wine. The editor filled a glass of champagne and pushed it towards him. He drained it, and it seemed to do him good, for he looked round the table, and the ghost of his old smile flickered across his face. "What on earth have you been up to, man?" said the doctor. The time traveler did not seem to hear. "Don't let me disturb you," he said, with a certain faltering articulation. "I'm all right." He stopped, held out his glass for more, and took it off at a draught. "That's good," he said. His eyes grew brighter, and a faint color came into his cheeks. His glance flickered over our faces with a certain dull approval, and then went round the warm and comfortable room. Then he spoke again, still as it were feeling his way among his words. "I'm going to wash and dress, and then I'll come down and explain things. Save me some of that mutton. I'm starving for a bit of meat." He looked across at the editor, who was a rare visitor, and hoped he was all right. The editor began a question. "Tell you presently," said the time traveler. "I'm funny. I'll be right in a minute." He put down his glass and walked towards the staircase door. Again I remarked his lameness and the soft padding sound of his footfall, and standing up in my place, I saw his feet as he went out. He had nothing on them but a pair of tattered, blood-stained socks. Then the door closed upon him. I had half a mind to follow, till I remembered how he detested any fuss about himself. For a minute, perhaps, my mind was wool-gathering. Then, "Remarkable behavior of an eminent scientist," I heard the editor say, thinking, after his wont, in headlines. And this brought my attention back to the bright dinner table. "What's the game?" said the journalist. "Has he been doing the amateur cadger? I don't follow." I met the eye of the psychologist and read my own interpretation in his face. I thought of the time traveler limping painfully upstairs. I don't think anyone else had noticed his lameness. The first to recover completely from this surprise was the medical man, who rang the bell. The time traveler hated to have servants waiting at dinner, or hot at that. He had a knife and fork with a grunt. The man followed suit. Conversation was exclamatory for a little while. And then the editor got fervent in his curiosity. "Does our friend eke out his modest income with a crossing, or has he his Nebuchadnezzar phases?" he inquired. "I feel assured it's this business of the time machine," I said, and took up the psychologist's account of our previous meeting. The new guests were frankly incredulous. The editor raised objections. What was this time traveling? A man couldn't cover himself with dust by rolling in a paradox, could he? And then, as the idea came home to him, he resorted to caricature. Hadn't he any clothes brushes in there? The journalist, too, would not believe at any price, and joined the editor in the easy work of heaping ridicule on the whole thing. They were both the new kind of journalist, very joyous, irreverent young men. Our special correspondent in the day after tomorrow reports, the journalist was saying, or rather shouting, when the time traveler came back. He was dressed in ordinary evening clothes, and nothing save his haggard look remained of the change that had startled me. I say, said the editor hilariously, these chaps here say you have been traveling into the middle of next week. Tell us all about little Roseberry, will you? What will you take for the lot? The time traveler came to the place reserved for him without a word. He smiled quietly in his old way. Where's my mutton? He said. What a treat it is to have fork into meat again. Story, cried the editor. Story be damned, said the time traveler.
Excuse me.
I want something to eat. I won't say a word until I get some
I'll be
peptide
right
into
back.
my arteries. Thanks, and the salt. One word, said I. Have you been time traveling? Yes, said the time traveler, with his mouth full, nodding his head. I'd give a shilling a line for a verbatim note, said the editor. The time traveler pushed his glass towards the silent man and rang it with his fingernail, at which the silent man, who had been staring at his face, started convulsively and poured him wine. The rest of the dinner was uncomfortable. For my own part, sudden questions kept rising to my lips. I dare say it was the same with the others. The journalist tried to relieve the tension by telling anecdotes of Hetty Potter. The time traveler devoted his attention to his dinner and displayed the appetite of a tramp. The medical man smoked a cigarette and watched the time traveler through his eyelashes. The silent man seemed even more clumsy than usual, and drank champagne with regularity and determination out of sheer nervousness. At last, the time traveler pushed his plate away and looked round us. I suppose I must apologize, he said. I was simply starving. I've had a most amazing time. He reached out his hand for a cigar and cut the end. But come into the smoking room. It's too long a story to tell over greasy plates. And ringing the bell in passing, he led the way into the adjoining room. You have told Blank and Dash and Chose about the machine, he said to me, leaning back in his easy chair and naming the three new guests. But the thing's a mere paradox, said the editor. I can't argue tonight. I don't mind telling you the story, but I can't argue. I will, he went on, tell you the story of what has happened to me, if you like, but you must refrain from interruptions. I want to tell it, badly. Most of it will sound like lying. So be it. It's true, every word of it, all the same. I was in my laboratory at 4 o'clock, and since then I've lived 8 days, such days as no human being ever lived before. I'm nearly worn out, but I shan't sleep till I've told this thing over to you. Then I shall go to bed. But no interruptions. Is it agreed? Agreed, said the editor, and the rest of us echoed, agreed. And with that, the time traveler began his story as I've set it forth. He sat back in his chair at first, and spoke like a weary man. Afterwards, he got more animated. In writing it down, I feel with only too much keenness the inadequacy of pen and ink, and above all, my own inadequacy to express its quality. You read, I will suppose, attentively enough, but you cannot see the speaker's white, sincere face in the bright circle of the little lamp, nor hear the intonation of his voice. You cannot know how his expression followed the turns of his story. Most of us hearers were in shadow, for the candles in the smoking room had not been lighted, and only the face of the journalist and the legs of the silent man from the knees downward were illuminated. At first, we glanced now and again at each other. After a time, we ceased to do that and looked only at the time traveler's face. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Time Machine, Chapter 3. I told some of you last Thursday of the principles of the time machine. I showed you the actual thing itself, incomplete in the workshop. There it is now, a little travel-worn truly, and one of the ivory bars is
All right, everyone. I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. Excuse me. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.